when I was a kid, I wanted to be a pilot. Then I figured a political theorist because that was really cool and you could rule the world, or at least try and rule the world. And then I went into acting and I discovered I loved it. And somewhere along the way, I just started writing. And I guess the way someone once asked me, which do I prefer, acting or writing? And I said, well, I love acting passionately, but... And he said, do you love writing? I said, I don't know, do you love breathing? It's an essential part of you. If you stop breathing, you die. If I stopped writing, I don't know what would happen to me, but it would be a fundamental loss. It's not something I love or hate. It's something that's a part of me and that I can't divorce myself from, so it transcends that. I had submitted some material to Marvel after working for them in my freshman year at college as a gopher. And they started buying. First, a couple of articles here, a couple of stories there. I got what I thought was a part-time job as an editorial assistant, and it seemed like a great idea. 2.5 days a week for Marvel to pay the rent, and then I could audition, I could go to class, I could make my career as an actor. And Murphy's Law kicked in. None of the work came in the 2.5 days I was there. It always came in the 2.5 days I wasn't there, no matter how we shifted my schedule. So out of frustration, rather than fire me, Marvel being what it was then, they made me full-time. And I thought, aha, this is great. I was working as Len Weins' associate editor. So he was editor-in-chief, I was his number 2. We were running the whole company together, which basically meant he made all the decisions and I did all the work. Proofreading and and processing and such. And that was when he and Dave were putting together the X-Men. And I would sit in on the plotting sessions because it was cool and because I loved Dave's work and I loved the characters he was coming up with, and I thought this is really neat stuff. And then Len decided he resigned as editor-in-chief and took as his writing assignments, as his exit package, 4 franchise books at the time, which were Spider-Man, the Hulk, Thor, and the Fantastic Four. But he didn't have any time left to do X-Men because he could budget a week for each book. The X-Men was the odd book out. So he asked me if I would be interested in writing it, and I didn't think twice. I just said, you betcha. In the beginning, there was Charles Xavier, a mutant, a telepath, a reader of minds, who gradually becomes aware that he is not unique in the world, that there are others like him, that he is not a freak of nature, but in fact represents the beginning of a new evolution in human history, the transition from Homo sapiens to something else, which, for sake of the argument, they call mutants. And his approach being a teacher is, how can we manage this change? How can we make this transition peaceful? To that end, he establishes a school for gifted youngsters where he hopes to collect mutants to inculcate in them a sense of ethics and responsibility, deriving from Stan's great line in Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, and send them out into the world to live productive lives. Unfortunately, against a backdrop of a world which is becoming increasingly tense about these strange, weird creatures that seem to be popping up all over. Now, the difference is, for the first 30 years of the X-Men's incarnation, mutants were a fairly small cluster in the population, superhero mutants anyway, and it was sort of a manageable change. Now, thanks to various policy shifts, there are millions of them. They're all over the world. They're in everybody's face. Suddenly, one little school in Westchester may not be enough to hold them. How do you control the change now when it's in everybody's face? How do you deal with the fact that they're all over the place, that there's no way of escaping them, that non-mutant human beings are at a significant disadvantage now? That's the storyline we're playing out today. What happened with Wolverine over the course of years was I began asking these questions. Who is he? Why is he the way he is? What does he want out of life? Does he have any wants? What way can I find to make him accessible to me as a writer and interesting to me as a writer, that I can then turn and make him accessible and interesting to the audience? our awareness, our personal awareness of psychotic killers is fairly limited, thank God. You don't. They're not people you run into on the street. So, other than portraying him as the ultimate boogeyman, how do you make him relevant to a reader? How do you create a character that the reader will want to come back issue after issue, year after year, and not be bored by the same sort of Johnny one note, I'm a psycho killer, I'm going berserk, I'm, mean and nasty and tough and don't. John Byrne, the artist John Byrne's take on Wolverine was, this is a guy who if you said hello to him the wrong way, he would cut your head off. So everybody walks on pins and needles around him, which is absolutely cool in terms of establishing a set of relationships. The problem is 50 issues later, 5 years later, if you're still doing the same thing for the same reason, you have to ask yourself, why hasn't anyone taken him outside, slapped him upside his head and said, what is your problem? Or why hasn't he slaughtered everybody? Because nobody can be that careful or that careless for that long without something actually happening. So then we had to, I found myself asking, what makes you tick? Why don't you go berserk all the time? What makes them tolerate you? What makes you want to be among them? When you're talking about Wolverine's entry into the X-Men, you have to go into sort of a little bit of backstory. Wolverine was originally created by Len Wein and John Romita, I think, for a debut in the Hulk as this crazy kind of Canadian adversary for him. Then when Len moved on with Dave Cockrum to create what became the new X-Men in 1974, he drafted Wolverine for the team. So I picked up the series with the second issue. So I am to a significant extent the foster father. I was handed a done deal as far as the cast goes, which is fine. The challenge for me as a writer in terms of Wolverine, and this sort of ran on for about 2 or 3 years until I got a handle on him, was how do you make a psychopath interesting? Because that was essentially what he was, this guy who, without warning, popped these claws out of his hands, goes psycho berserker, and slice up everything in sight, and then, settle down again. It's like living with a real Wolverine. How do you make him interesting once you get beyond that initial sort of, whoa, this is scary? And that's what led me and Frank Miller to the thought processes that built his character that we presented in the Wolverine miniseries, where what I came up with is the sense of him as a failed samurai, that he has this ideal of himself, this goal for himself, this vision of what he wants to be, that he is constantly striving for, but there is this chemical thing inside of him, this possibly psychological, possibly genetic, that he may never be free of, that will keep yanking him back right at the moment of fulfillment. So in Wolverine's case, as with many of the X-Men, the key is the struggle. It's not that he will ever succeed in achieving his quest. Like Lancelot, will he ever find the Holy Grail? No, Galahad will find it. In Wolverine's case, it's the quest for the Grail. It's the quest for the achievement of his ideal, which will probably never be fulfilled, but which for him to abandon would be to essentially yield to the dark side of his nature. And in this case, the striving is what keeps him going, is what gives him purpose, but what also defines him as a hero, and then ultimately what defines him as a tragic hero. Usually you come up with a great idea and you graft the characters onto it. In this case, the whole series, the actual structural events of the series are secondary. The whole thing is designed around Wolverine's exploration of self, discovery of self, exploration of self, acceptance or defiance of the consequences. And it was wonderful because we were sort of taking him apart and putting him back together again with an understanding of what makes him tick. And by our understanding, we had the ability then to convey it to the audience. And suddenly, where we had a character who was sort of, okay, we now had the foundation for a character who proceeded to become the conscience and heart of the team. Here's where you get into the craft of writing for comics, which is actually different from the craft of writing, period. Comics is a shorthand medium. We have 22 pages, on average these days. When I started, it was like 17, to tell our story, which roughs out to about 100 images from page 1 to page 22. Those 100 images have to create the illusion of movement in much the same way that a frame of film has to do that to create a movie. But within that 22 pages, the only tools we have to convey information are the pictures and the words. So the writer's primary job, the most important job, is to tell the story to the artist, because without those visual images, we're wasting our time. The idea was, for me, prejudice. These kids are hated, are feared for no other reason than they are born. And it's a stigma that will stay with them for their whole lives, regardless of what they do. There will always be someone who thinks muties, evil. And bearing in mind, this is the 60s, bearing in mind that I'm an immigrant, even though I am white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. Half of my family is Jewish, so there is an awareness of what it's like to be on the other side of the fence. How can we use that in these stories to try and get through to the reader? And as I said, it was the 60s, it was the 70s. There was a desire to try and use comics without sacrificing the adventure, without sacrificing the excitement and the story content, to make some points, to try and build on what Stan had established in the 60s with Spider-Man and the FF, to take comics to a newer level, to a more relevant level, to speak to our audience in ways that would surprise them and make them think and make them move them in a different direction. And it worked. It was successful. It had impact. The problem was none of us ever conceived of the fact that I might be around in the book for the better part of 20 years. I mean, when we started, we didn't think that the industry would survive more than 5 or 6 years. We figured we'd all be out of a job by the 80s. Who knew? But by the time you got to the 90s, suddenly you have people saying, oh, is the X-Men still about prejudice? The argument I always came back to is the day I can pick up a paper and not see a story about prejudice here, especially, but in the world, is the day the X-Men don't need that foundation anymore. But for so long as it exists, so long as there are people whose knee-jerk reaction to other people is, you're different, therefore I don't trust you, they're different, therefore I cast you out or I hate you, then the X-Men need to be as a series. From the moment I actually came to the United States, there's always this deep down sense of being an outsider. It isn't a very big thing. I mean, obviously I don't sound like I'm English anymore, though my parents do. And my sister sounds like she's pure Long Island. But it is, especially as relates to a series like the X-Men, a nice way of having that sense of being somewhere different, somewhere new, somewhere that isn't where you're from, where you were born, and having to establish a place for yourself, a home for yourself, a purpose for yourself. I can look around and see an entire industry that has been shaped and defined by what I and a few artists did from essentially 1975 to 1988, 1990. A whole generation of artists, a whole style of storytelling. It's realizing that the work I've done has touched people that I never imagined, and is continuing to do so. That's sort of incredibly cool. And, there are a lot worse things in life. And so hopefully the challenge now is to remain true to the people that you've inspired in the past, and work as hard as you can to inspire people now.